You ever just look at your cat and wonder what in the world is going on in that furry little head of theirs? One minute they're a zoomy-fueled blur, the next a complete puddle of fluff. Well, it turns out a really fascinating new study suggests the answer isn't so much in their head, but right outside your window. We're going to unpack the science behind whether the weather is secretly pulling all the strings on your cat's behavior. So, let me just ask you this. Does this sound familiar? Your cat gets extra lazy in the summer, but maybe a little more particular, a little more busy in the fall. Turns out you're not just imagining things. Scientists have been asking this exact same question, wondering if our feline friends are all living their lives according to some kind of secret seasonal schedule. But, to get to the bottom of this, researchers couldn't just sit there with a notepad watching a few cats. No way. They needed to go seriously high-tech to decode the secret lives of these mysterious little creatures. They basically launched a full-blown investigation into their daily habits. And think about the challenge here for a second. We're talking about tracking 8 very distinct behaviors, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for an entire year. Can you imagine trying to log every single time your cat eats, or sleeps, or scratches for 365 days straight? That is a mountain of data. So how on earth did they do it? With these things, accelerometers. The easiest way to think of them is like little Fitbits for cats. These tiny sensors, pretty much the same kind that are in your smartphone, were attached to the collars of 7 research cats. And these cats were all living together in a semi-outdoor colony, so a managed group environment. And those collars, they captured every single movement, all day, all night. Okay, so you've got all this raw data. Now what? Well, this is where it gets really cool. They fed all that movement data into a machine learning model, an AI, that was trained to recognize these 8 specific behaviors. We're not just talking about active or inactive. The AI could tell the difference between a cat lying down versus sitting, or grooming versus scratching, or even when it was using the litter box. I mean, that level of detail is exactly what makes this study so groundbreaking. And once they had all that data organized, the first layer of clues really started to emerge when they grouped all these behaviors by season. And wow, the shifts they found were, well, they were pretty dramatic. Get this. The study found that in the summer, these cats spent over 60% of their time just lying down. That is a huge chunk of their day just dedicated to being a loaf in the heat. It pretty much confirms what all of us cat owners already suspected. Summer is definitely prime nap season. But then, autumn rolls around and there is this massive shift. The time they spend lying down absolutely plummets, and the time they spend sitting skyrockets to over 50% of their day. They literally go from being horizontal summer sloths to sitting upright, alert, and observant in the fall. So, what are they doing while they're sitting around so much? Well, the data shows that autumn also brought a major spike in 2 very specific behaviors: grooming and scratching. It turns out they spent way more time on personal hygiene in the fall than in any other season. Which brings us to the big question, right? Why? What is it about autumn that suddenly makes cats so obsessed with their coats? And this is where the scientists added another really brilliant layer to their analysis. They realized that the word season is really just a label. The real drivers of behavior are the specific day-to-day weather conditions that make up that season. So it's not just autumn, it's the temperature, the humidity, and the wind of autumn that are really pulling the strings. So to get a much more accurate picture, they combined temperature, humidity, and wind into a single variable they called the Temperature Humidity Wind Index, or THW. All you really need to know is that it's a scientific way of calculating the feels-like temperature for a cat, and that gave them a much more powerful tool for their analysis. And by using that index, suddenly, these super clear patterns just popped right out. When that feels-like temperature went up and the days got longer, the cats spent a lot more time eating, lying down, no big surprise there, and standing. And on the flip side, more heat and daylight meant less time spent on, well, pretty much everything else. They were less active, they groomed and scratched less, they used the litter box less, and as we saw, they spent way less time sitting. It's like the heat just simplifies their entire daily agenda down to the bare essentials: eat and rest. Oh, and the researchers also isolated one more factor: rain. And they found that when it rained, the cats spent less time grooming and scratching. It's just a fascinating little detail that adds another piece to this whole behavioral puzzle.
Okay, so we've got all this data, right? We have the seasonal shifts, we have the weather correlations, but what does it all actually mean? Let's connect these clues and figure out the bigger picture for our feline friends. All right, remember that big mystery about the huge spike in grooming and scratching back in the fall? Well, here's the aha moment. The researchers' conclusion, and I'm quoting directly from their paper here, is that an increase in coat density during autumn increases grooming and scratching behaviors. In other words, they're growing in their thick winter coat, and all that extra fur just requires a whole lot more maintenance.
And I have to share this little detail because it really shows you the human side of doing research. While they were analyzing all the data, they noticed one cat's grooming numbers were completely off the charts. It turns out it wasn't just a very, very clean cat. The poor thing had seasonal allergies. They actually had to exclude her data, which just goes to show you that science in the real world can get a little messy sometimes.
And that brings us to the final and maybe the most important question of all. This study was done on cats living together in a semi-outdoor colony. But what about your cat living that cozy life indoors? How might things like central heating, artificial lights, and a totally different social dynamic change this story? It really makes you wonder just how much of their wild, weather-driven instincts are still running the show, right there on your living room rug.